a Swiss immigrant peddling shoelaces door to door, somehow ends up controlling enough copper to electrify an entire nation. A family worth billions today that traces back to a man who couldn't afford proper shoes for himself. And a dynasty that turned literal dirt into one of America's most influential fortunes, reshaping industries, politics, and even art itself. Most people know the Guggenheim name from museums or foundations. They're looking at the legacy, not the empire. The real story isn't about art galleries in Manhattan. It's about mines so deep they reached hell itself, smelters that turned mountains into profit, and a family that figured out how to monopolize the metal that powered the modern world. We're talking about the Guggenheims, a dynasty that went from Swiss poverty to American royalty in 3 generations, building an empire that made Rockefeller look like he was playing checkers while they played chess. Meyer Guggenheim arrived in Philadelphia in 1847 with nothing, literally nothing. He was 20 years old, spoke broken English, and his first job was peddling stove polish and household goods from a pushcart. Picture that. A young man walking Philadelphia streets, knocking on doors, trying to convince housewives to buy polish from a foreigner they could barely understand. This wasn't glamorous. This was survival. But Meyer had something most people miss. He could read patterns in chaos. While peddling, he noticed which products moved, which neighborhoods had money, which merchants needed suppliers. Within 5 years, he'd saved enough to import embroidery from Switzerland. Not a sexy business, but it worked. The Civil War hit, and suddenly everyone needed supplies. Meyer pivoted to spices and coffee. By 1872, he'd accumulated about $300,000. Decent money, but nothing compared to what came next. Here's where it gets interesting. Meyer's fortune didn't come from hard work or clever trading. It came from a poker game. In 1881, a man named Charles Graham owed Meyer money. Couldn't pay. Instead, he offered shares in 2 silver and lead mines in Leadville, Colorado. Most businessmen would have laughed. Mining was a gamble. Mines went bust constantly. But Meyer took the shares, a third of the AY and mini mines buried deep in Colorado mountains. Those mines hit not just small returns, they were producing roughly $15,000 in profit monthly. Meyer saw something others didn't. This wasn't about silver. It was about control. He bought out his partners, took full ownership, and then did what separated him from every other lucky miner in America. He didn't just dig metal out of the ground. He controlled what happened to it afterward. The Philadelphia Smelting and Refining Company emerged in 1888. Meyer and his 7 sons built their own smelter in Pueblo, Colorado. Why does this matter? Because miners were at the mercy of smelting companies who processed their ore. Those companies set prices, took massive cuts, and miners had no choice. Meyer flipped the game. He became the processor. Suddenly his mines fed his smelters, and other miners had to use his facilities or ship ore elsewhere at higher cost. Vertical integration before that term even existed. His sons became extensions of this vision. Daniel, the eldest, ran operations. Murray handled sales. Solomon managed the smelters. Simon and William took on expansion. Benjamin and Isaac filled gaps wherever needed. This wasn't a company. It was a machine with 7 synchronized parts, all answering to Meyer's ruthless efficiency. By the 1890s, something shifted. Silver prices collapsed. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act got repealed in 1893 and mines across America went dark. The Guggenheims pivoted instantly. Copper. The world was electrifying. Cities needed wiring, factories needed motors. Telegraph lines stretched across continents. All of it demanded copper. And Meyer recognized the next empire before anyone else saw it coming. They moved into Mexico, buying the massive Asarco smelters. Then they pushed into Alaska, securing copper deposits when the territory was still frontier wilderness. But the real power move? Utah Copper Company. In 1903, Daniel Guggenheim invested in what seemed insane at the time. A mine at Bingham Canyon that processed low-grade copper ore, metal so diluted in rock that most mining operations ignored it. The technology didn't exist to extract it profitably. Daniel didn't care about current technology. He funded engineers to invent new methods, steam shovels, rail systems, industrial-scale processing. They created open-pit mining on a scale America had never witnessed. Bingham Canyon became the largest man-made excavation on Earth. You could see it from space decades later. That mine alone produced more copper than entire countries. The Guggenheims weren't just mining anymore. They were reshaping geology itself, carving mountains into craters, moving Earth by the millions of tons. And the profits? Staggering. By 1910, the family controlled roughly 80% of the world's copper, silver, and lead production. Not American production. Global production. They'd gone from a pushcart in Philadelphia to a monopoly that powered the industrial age. Meyer died in 1905, but his machine kept running. His sons expanded into nitrates in Chile, diamonds in Africa, rubber in the Congo. They financed revolutions when governments didn't cooperate. They crushed competitors through sheer capital dominance. When smaller mining companies tried to compete, Guggenheim smelters refused their ore or quoted prices that guaranteed bankruptcy. It wasn't personal. It was structure. They'd built a system where losing to them was the only option. But here's what most people miss about dynastic wealth. It's not about making money. That's step one. The Guggenheims had already won that game by 1910. What came next was far more complex, far more calculated, and it involved a shift that would define their legacy for the next century. Because controlling industries is temporary. Markets shift, technologies change, governments interfere. The smartest families understand something deeper. Real power isn't in mines. It's in what you do with the fortune after the mines run dry. That transformation didn't happen in boardrooms. It happened through the next generation, through decisions that seemed to waste money, and through a vision that turned industrial profits into cultural immortality. Daniel Guggenheim understood what his father never fully grasped. Metal empires crumble, markets collapse, technologies become obsolete. But culture compounds across centuries. In 1919, he did something that confused every industrialist in America. He gave away millions to create the Guggenheim Foundation, funding fellowships for artists, writers, scientists. People who produced nothing you could weigh or sell. Wall Street thought he'd lost his mind. Why would a copper baron subsidize poets? Because Daniel saw what Carnegie had figured out a decade earlier. Monopolies attract regulation, fortunes attract taxes. But philanthropy, that builds monuments. It writes your name into history with ink that doesn't fade. His younger brother Solomon took it further. In 1937, he hired Frank Lloyd Wright to design a museum. Not just any museum. A building so radical that construction permits got rejected repeatedly. City planners called it dangerous. Architects called it impossible. Solomon didn't care. He wanted a structure that would still stop people cold 100 years later. The Guggenheim Museum opened in 1959, 6 months after Solomon died. That spiraling white fortress on Fifth Avenue didn't just house art, it became art. Millions of visitors have walked that continuous ramp, and every single one remembers the building as much as the paintings. That's legacy engineering. You don't build a rectangle and hope people remember your name. You build something so architecturally aggressive that forgetting becomes impossible. But here's where the family's strategy gets genuinely brilliant. They diversified legacy itself, not just museums, aviation. Daniel's son Harry became obsessed with flight in the 1920s when airplanes were still death traps held together with wire and prayer. He funded the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at Caltech, bankrolling research that directly led to modern aviation safety. Instrument flight, weather analysis, aircraft design, everything that makes flying routine instead of suicidal. Guggenheim money accelerated it by decades. Harry also sponsored Lindbergh's tour after his Atlantic crossing, turning a stunt pilot into an American icon. That wasn't charity, it was brand association. Guggenheim became synonymous with progress, with the future, with the idea that technology could save humanity. And when you're linked to airplanes and art and scientific advancement, people forget you made your first billions crushing unions in Bolivian silver mines. Peggy Guggenheim took a completely different route. She fled to Europe, collected modern art when it was still considered garbage, and became the person who decided what mattered culturally. Picasso, Pollock, Kandinsky. She didn't just buy their work, she made them canonical. Her Venice Palazzo became pilgrimage site for anyone serious about 20th century art. She transformed taste itself into a Guggenheim asset. That's when you realize the full scope of what this family engineered. They don't just have wealth, they have curatorial power over what society values. Museums bearing their name decide which artists get remembered. Foundations with their money choose which scientists get funded. Fellowships with their backing determine who gets platforms. They shifted from controlling commodities to controlling culture, and culture is the only monopoly governments can't break up. The mining empire, mostly sold off by the 1960s. Asarco filed for bankruptcy in 2005. Bingham Canyon still operates, but it's owned by Rio Tinto now. The Guggenheims don't need it anymore. They'd already converted industrial capital into something far more durable. Today, the family's wealth is nearly impossible to calculate because it's not concentrated. It's distributed across trusts, foundations, collections, real estate holdings scattered globally. Some estimates put it north of 5 billion, others suggest much higher. But the number almost doesn't matter. Their real asset isn't dollars, it's institutional permanence. Walk into any major city, you'll find Guggenheim fingerprints, the museums, obviously. But also the research labs they funded, the schools they endowed, the artists they elevated who now define entire movements. They built infrastructure for prestige, and prestige generates its own returns across generations. Here's what separates families like this from everyone else who gets rich. Most wealthy people optimize for their lifetime. Maybe their kids' lifetime if they're smart. The Guggenheims optimized for centuries. Meyer's sons could have just managed the mines, paid themselves dividends, lived like kings until the copper ran out. Instead, they engineered a legacy machine that operates independently of any single descendant's competence. A great-great-grandchild of Meyer Guggenheim could be completely useless at business, terrible with money, and they'd still benefit from institutions built 100 years ago. That's the ultimate form of wealth. Systems that outlive their creators and protect even the mediocre descendants, and they're still building. New Guggenheim museums keep getting proposed. Abu Dhabi, Helsinki, plans that stretch decades into the future. Each one extends the brand, the influence, the cultural authority. Each one ensures that in 2124, people will still know the name, even if they've forgotten it started with a man selling stove polish in Philadelphia. The family that arrived in America with nothing transformed twice. First into industrial titans, then into cultural architects. That second transformation is what ensured survival. Because industries die, but museums don't. Foundations don't. Legacy institutions, once established and endowed, achieve something close to immortality. Meyer Guggenheim probably never imagined his name on a museum designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. He was too busy calculating smelter efficiency and crushing competitors. But his sons understood something he didn't live long enough to fully execute. The greatest fortune isn't the one you die with. It's the one that makes your name inescapable centuries after your death. They didn't just build wealth, they built inevitability. And that might be the most valuable commodity any family has ever mined. The Guggenheims prove something most people never grasp about real wealth. It's not about the billions you make, it's about the centuries you remain relevant. From Meyer's pushcart to museums that will outlive us all, they didn't just get rich. They made forgetting them impossible. And that's a monopoly no government can touch.